Jimmy Durante set a small, weathered wooden box on the desk, his gravelly voice suddenly and completely unsteady, and said that what was inside had never been shown to another living soul outside his own family. Several people present later described this specific moment as genuinely startling, given how completely it departed from the boundless comedic confidence that had defined every one of Durante's countless previous broadcast appearances across his extensive career. It was November 3rd, 1976, and earlier that evening, before a studio audience of 300 people at NBC Studios in Burbank, Jimmy Durante had recorded what would become one of the most quietly devastating broadcasts of his entire long and celebrated career, a broadcast that would reach 22 million American households later that same night when it finally aired. Coming up, exactly what was inside that small wooden box, the real name of a young soldier Durante had visited in a military hospital more than 3 decades earlier, and the specific and largely secret commitment Durante had made to that soldier's family, a commitment he had honored quietly for over 30 years without a single word of public credit. This is a story almost nobody outside Durante's own closest circle ever had any reason to suspect existed at all. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comments section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night, because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that one of America's most beloved comedic performers had been quietly keeping a promise to a dying soldier's family for more than 3 decades. Jimmy Durante spent much of the Second World War entertaining American troops, traveling extensively to military hospitals and training bases across the country with the same boundless comedic energy that had made him one of the most beloved performers in American entertainment, understanding, with a specific and genuine seriousness that few of his own audiences ever fully appreciated, exactly how significant these particular performances were to the young men he entertained, many of whom were recovering from injuries that would shape the remainder of their lives. The specific scope of this wartime touring deserves fuller documentation, because it illustrates exactly how substantial a commitment Durante made to this work, despite the considerable disruption it caused to his own ongoing professional career. He traveled to dozens of military hospitals and training installations across multiple years of the war, often performing several shows in a single day, adjusting his usual boundless physical comedy to accommodate the specific and sometimes considerable physical limitations of patients confined to hospital beds or wheelchairs. Colleagues who toured alongside him during this period consistently described a level of genuine dedication that exceeded what military entertainment programs technically required, Durante frequently extending his scheduled visits well beyond their allotted time, specifically to spend additional moments with patients who seemed to need it most. In the autumn of 1944, during an extended tour of military hospitals along the eastern seaboard, Durante visited a naval hospital in Virginia, housing a considerable number of young sailors recovering from injuries sustained during combat in the Pacific Theater. This particular hospital, according to military records from the period, served as a major rehabilitation center for sailors evacuated from some of the most intense fighting of the Pacific Campaign, housing patients facing a wide range of injuries and a correspondingly wide range of long recovery timelines stretching from mere weeks to, in some cases, the remainder of their lives. According to an account eventually confirmed by one of Durante's closest friends decades later, Durante was performing his usual hospital ward routine, moving bed to bed with jokes and small comedic bits tailored to lift the spirits of men facing genuinely difficult and often uncertain recoveries, when he encountered a young sailor named Thomas Whitfield, a 19-year-old from rural Ohio, who had lost the use of both legs during an engagement in the Pacific and who greeted Durante's arrival with a specific and considerable reluctance that stood apart from the enthusiasm most patients displayed. Durante, according to this same account, recognized something in the young sailor's particular quality of withdrawal that made him pause his usual routine and sit down beside the young man's bed rather than simply moving on to the next patient as his tour schedule technically required. This specific instinct, according to people who witnessed similar moments across Durante's wartime touring, reflected a genuine and considerable sensitivity to emotional distress that stood in notable contrast to the boundless and largely uncomplicated comedic persona audiences associated with him, evidence of a considerably more perceptive and considerably more emotionally attuned man existing underneath his famous public exuberance. What followed, that particular afternoon in the Naval Hospital ward, was a considerably longer conversation than Durante's tour itinerary technically allowed for, the young sailor eventually confiding that he had received word, only days earlier, that the young woman he had been engaged to marry before shipping out had ended their engagement upon learning the full extent of his injuries, a specific and devastating blow that had left him genuinely uncertain whether his life, in its new and permanently altered form, was still worth continuing. The specific texture of this conversation deserves fuller and more careful documentation because it illuminates exactly how genuinely difficult Whitfield's circumstances actually were at that particular moment. He described, according to the account Durante later gave his close friend, feeling as though every plan he had made for his own future, marriage, a family, a life built around the physical labor of the family farm he had grown up on, had been permanently foreclosed by injuries that left him unable to walk and facing a lifetime of physical limitation that 19-year-old Thomas Whitfield had genuinely never imagined confronting. The broken engagement, arriving on top of this already considerable adjustment, represented, in Whitfield's own words as Durante later recalled them, the final confirmation of a fear he had been quietly carrying since first waking up in that hospital bed, that his injuries had made him fundamentally unlovable and permanently incapable of building the life he had always assumed would naturally unfold before him. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment because what happens next reveals a promise Jimmy Durante kept quietly for more than 30 years. Durante, according to the account eventually given decades later, spent considerably longer with young Thomas Whitfield than with any other patient on that particular hospital visit, missing several subsequent stops on his scheduled tour in order to remain at the young sailor's bedside. This decision carried genuine professional consequence at the time, according to the tour coordinator who managed Durante's hospital visit schedule, requiring subsequent adjustments to an already tightly organized itinerary that had been carefully coordinated across multiple military installations to maximize the number of patients Durante could reach during his limited touring window. Durante apparently absorbed this scheduling complication without complaint, according to this coordinator's later recollection, instructing his own staff simply to handle whatever logistical adjustments became necessary rather than cutting short the time he was spending with a patient whose particular distress he had recognized as requiring considerably more than his usual brief, morale-boosting visit. He did not offer easy reassurance or empty comedic deflection, according to this account, but instead spoke with the young man directly and honestly about the specific difficulty of rebuilding a life after devastating loss, drawing on his own considerable experience navigating an entertainment industry that had, across his own extensive career, repeatedly tested his resilience in ways the general public rarely understood. Durante shared, according to this same account, several specific and previously private reflections about his own experience of professional rejection and professional reinvention across a career that had, by that point in 1944, already spanned several decades and multiple significant transitions between vaudeville, film, and radio, transitions that had each required him to rebuild his own sense of professional identity from a position of genuine uncertainty about whether audiences would continue to embrace him. He told Whitfield, according to what Durante later recounted, that rebuilding a meaningful life after devastating loss was never a single dramatic act of recovery, but rather an accumulated series of small, deliberate choices made consistently over considerable time, a specific philosophy of gradual reconstruction that Durante said he had developed through his own repeated professional reinventions, and that he genuinely believed applied equally to the considerably more personal reconstruction Whitfield now faced. Before leaving that afternoon, Durante made the young sailor a specific and considerable promise that he would personally stay in contact with him and with his family for as long as it took Whitfield to rebuild a genuinely meaningful life, a promise that Durante remarkably kept in full for the following 3 decades. Durante reportedly wrote his own personal contact information on a small scrap of paper before leaving the ward that afternoon, a specific and deliberate gesture that several people who later heard the full account described as unusual, given that Durante's considerable fame typically required him to guard his personal accessibility quite carefully, evidence of exactly how seriously he intended this particular promise to be taken from its very first moment. He began writing to Whitfield regularly following that hospital visit, letters that continued long after Whitfield's eventual discharge and return to his family's farm in rural Ohio. And when Durante learned, through this ongoing correspondence, that Whitfield's family faced genuine financial hardship connected directly to the additional medical and rehabilitation costs his injuries required, Durante began quietly and consistently providing financial assistance, support that continued for years without any public acknowledgement or any expectation of public credit. The specific rhythm of this correspondence deserves fuller documentation because it illustrates exactly how genuinely sustained Durante's commitment actually was across a period when his own professional career demanded considerable travel and considerable time commitment. He wrote to Whitfield with a consistency that friends who observed his private correspondence habits described as remarkable, given his otherwise demanding schedule. Letters that addressed not only Whitfield's practical circumstances, but also considerably more personal territory, encouragement during difficult periods of physical rehabilitation, genuine interest in Whitfield's gradual efforts to rebuild a working life despite his physical limitations, and the kind of sustained personal attention that friends said Durante extended to remarkably few people outside his own immediate family across his entire extensive life. The specific mechanics of this support deserve fuller understanding, because they illustrate exactly how deliberately Durante worked to protect the Whitfield family's privacy and dignity throughout the entire arrangement. He arranged payments through a considerably indirect channel, a family attorney who managed the transactions without ever revealing Durante's specific identity to anyone outside the Whitfield family's immediate circle. Understanding that broad public knowledge of this arrangement risked transforming a private act of genuine care into precisely the kind of public spectacle that would have undermined the specific dignity he was attempting to preserve for a family already navigating considerable hardship. This careful arrangement required Durante to maintain, across several decades, a level of discretion that considerably exceeded ordinary charitable giving, coordinating regularly with the family attorney to ensure that support arrived in a manner that felt, to the Whitfield family, like a natural extension of their own, gradually improving circumstances, rather than an obvious and potentially uncomfortable act of external charity. Durante specifically instructed the attorney, according to correspondence eventually reviewed by family members after his death, to frame each disbursement in terms connected to legitimate business or agricultural development opportunities whenever possible, a specific fiction maintained consistently across decades, precisely to protect Thomas Whitfield's considerable pride and his own genuine desire to feel that he was building his post-war life through his own effort rather than through dependency on external charity. Thomas Whitfield eventually married, started a small business repairing farm equipment despite his physical limitations, and raised 3 children, a life that he and his family always credited, at least in part, to the specific stability that Durante's quiet and sustained support had provided during the most genuinely difficult years following his return from war. The specific trajectory of Whitfield's eventual recovery deserves fuller documentation, because it illustrates exactly what Durante's sustained support actually made possible across the following decades. Whitfield met his eventual wife, Margaret, at a community dance nearly 3 years after his discharge, a courtship that Whitfield himself, in letters to Durante that survived among family papers, credited directly to the specific confidence Durante's encouragement had helped him rebuild during the darkest period of his recovery. He established his farm equipment repair business gradually, starting with basic tools purchased with Durante's quiet financial assistance, eventually building a genuinely successful small enterprise that served considerable portions of his rural Ohio county for the following 2 decades, employing at its peak several additional workers and providing his family with a stability that would have seemed genuinely impossible during those darkest days in the Naval Hospital. Whitfield himself died in 1971, 5 years before this particular broadcast, but Durante had continued his relationship with the broader Whitfield family even after Thomas's death, maintaining contact with Whitfield's widow and children throughout the following years. This continued relationship, following Thomas's own death from causes unrelated to his wartime injuries, reflected, according to Margaret Whitfield's own later account, a genuine and lasting bond that had grown to encompass the entire family, rather than remaining limited to Durante's original relationship with Thomas alone, evidence that what began as a single afternoon of hospital-ward compassion had, across 3 decades, become something considerably closer to genuine extended family. Johnny Carson had booked Jimmy Durante for that evening's taping to discuss his continuing career, an appearance built around warm and largely nostalgic conversation about one of the most beloved careers in American entertainment history. Nobody on the production staff had any indication that the taping would turn toward anything resembling Durante's decades-long and largely private commitment to a soldier's family. Carson himself had genuine personal admiration for Durante that extended across many years of professional association, having hosted him on numerous previous occasions, and having consistently found him one of the most reliably warm and reliably entertaining guests the program ever featured, a performer whose considerable age and considerable career longevity by 1976 gave every one of his appearances a specific and irreplaceable quality of connection to an earlier and increasingly distant era of American entertainment. Carson's production team anticipated this particular taping would follow the same comfortable and thoroughly enjoyable pattern that had characterized virtually every one of Durante's previous appearances, an assumption that made the eventual direction of the conversation considerably more surprising to everyone present than anyone had anticipated walking into the studio that afternoon. The taping began exactly as anticipated, Durante performing several minutes of his beloved comedic material with the same boundless energy that had defined his public persona for decades. The studio audience responded with the specific warmth reserved for a performer whose career they had followed, in many cases for their entire lives. several audience members later, recalling the particular joy of watching a man in his early 80s perform with an energy that seemed genuinely undiminished by the considerable passage of time since his earliest broadcasts decades earlier. Roughly 18 minutes into the conversation, Carson, aware of Durante's own well-documented history of wartime hospital visits, asked him a broad and largely open-ended question about which specific memory from those visits had stayed with him most vividly across the following decades. This particular question emerged naturally from the broader conversation's earlier drift toward Durante's considerable wartime touring, a topic Carson had raised with genuine curiosity rather than any specific anticipation of the revelation it would eventually produce. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Jimmy Durante was quiet for a long moment, and several people present described a specific and unmistakable shift in his characteristically boundless expression, something considerably more inward and reflective beginning to surface. He said that he had never publicly discussed one particular hospital visit or the specific promise it had produced, and that something about the sincerity of Carson's question had made him feel, for the first time in over 3 decades, that the moment had finally arrived to share it. He paused for a long moment before continuing, several people present noting the specific quality of his hesitation, a man visibly weighing decades of careful private discretion against a genuine and newly formed conviction that the story finally deserved to be told. He reached beneath the desk and lifted a small, weathered wooden box onto its surface, holding it for a long moment without opening it. He explained, for the first time in any public setting, the specific circumstances of that 1944 hospital visit, the young sailor's devastating heartbreak, and the promise Durante had made and kept for the following 30 years. He opened the box to reveal a small collection of letters, photographs of the Whitfield family across several decades, and a single military medal that Thomas Whitfield had eventually mailed to Durante with a note thanking him for giving him a reason to keep living. Durante held up several of these items individually, describing each with a specific and considerable tenderness that several people present said revealed a side of him that his boundless public comedic energy had never previously suggested. He described the specific letter Whitfield had written accompanying the medal, reading a brief portion aloud in a voice that several people present described as carrying a rawness entirely absent from his usual boundlessly confident public delivery. A young man's genuine gratitude for a stranger who had, on one ordinary afternoon in 1944, decided that his particular pain deserved more attention and more time than an already demanding tour schedule technically allowed for. Durante also described a specific photograph included among the box's contents, an image of Thomas Whitfield standing beside his completed farm equipment repair shop several years after the war, a specific and considerable milestone that Whitfield had apparently insisted on documenting and sending to Durante directly, understanding, in his own words, as Durante recalled them, that Durante deserved to see the tangible proof of exactly what his sustained encouragement had ultimately made possible. Johnny Carson, listening with genuine and evident emotion, asked Durante why he had finally decided to share this story now. Durante said that Thomas Whitfield's widow had recently told him, during a phone call just weeks earlier, that her grandchildren had begun asking questions about the mysterious family friend who had quietly supported them for so many years, and Durante had realized that the story deserved to exist somewhere beyond his own private memory before it was lost entirely. Durante elaborated further, describing the specific weight of this phone call with Margaret Whitfield, now in her own later years, and her gentle but genuine request that Durante consider finally allowing the family's grandchildren to understand the full story of a relationship that had shaped their family's entire trajectory across more than 3 decades without any of them fully understanding its actual origin or its actual significance. He said that hearing Margaret describe her grandchildren's genuine curiosity about this mysterious figure who had quietly appeared in family stories for their entire lives had convinced him that continuing to protect his own privacy indefinitely risked denying an entire younger generation the calm opportunity to understand exactly what quiet, sustained commitment across decades had actually made possible for their own family's stability and success. The studio audience sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete they experienced at any taping that year, watching one of America's most beloved comedic performers reveal a promise he had kept quietly for more than 3 decades. What followed was a considerably longer and more candid conversation than anyone had anticipated. Durante discussing the specific and continuing significance of small, sustained acts of care extended long after any dramatic crisis had passed. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described the specific and unusual privilege of witnessing this particular revelation. One audience member, a woman whose own father had served in the Pacific Theater during the same period as Whitfield, told a reporter that watching Durante's account had given her a considerably deeper appreciation for the countless similar, largely undocumented relationships that likely existed between wartime entertainers and the servicemen they visited. Relationships that history had, in most cases, simply never had the opportunity to fully document or fully understand. Durante spoke, in particular, about the specific and easily overlooked difference between crisis intervention and genuine long-term commitment, describing his own conviction that the considerably more difficult and considerably more significant work of supporting someone through recovery happened not in the dramatic initial moments of connection, but in the accumulated, unremarkable years of consistent follow-through that followed. A specific philosophy, he said, had shaped not only his relationship with Whitfield, but his broader approach to friendship and loyalty across his entire extensive life. Carson listened throughout with genuine and evident respect, understanding that Durante was offering, in this exact conversation, a considerably more complete and considerably more philosophically developed account of his own values than audiences had ever previously had access to across his entire celebrated public career. NBC's switchboard received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast, viewers writing specifically to describe how deeply moved they had been learning about a promise sustained so quietly for so many decades. Several of these callers specifically mentioned their own experiences either honoring or failing to honor long-term commitments across their own lives, describing a particular resonance in learning that one of America's most beloved comedic performers had maintained this level of quiet, sustained follow-through across more than 3 decades, without any expectation of recognition. One caller, a veteran himself who had struggled for years with his own reintegration following his military service, told a production staff member that hearing Durante describe the specific patience and specific consistency his support of Whitfield had required gave him a considerably clearer understanding of exactly what genuine long-term recovery from trauma actually looked like. Evidence that meaningful healing rarely occurred through single dramatic interventions, but rather through exactly the kind of accumulated, sustained care Durante had demonstrated across decades. This response, echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of one beloved performer's private generosity, a broader recognition among American viewers about what genuine and lasting commitment actually required in practice. Jimmy Durante continued his considerable career for several more years following that broadcast, and he died on January 29, 1980. 4 years later, his obituaries specifically referencing his decades of quiet, largely undocumented support for military families as one of the most genuinely admirable aspects of an already remarkable public life. In the years following that broadcast, according to people close to him, Durante found the experience of finally speaking about Thomas Whitfield publicly to be genuinely significant, describing it in a later private conversation as one of the few moments in his extensive career when he felt he had fully honored a promise not simply through decades of quiet action, but through finally allowing that action to be properly understood and properly remembered by the people who would carry the family's story forward. He continued corresponding with Margaret Whitfield and her grandchildren until his own death, and several members of the Whitfield family attended his funeral in 1980, an attendance that surprised several of Durante's own professional colleagues who had no previous knowledge of the specific family connection that had quietly persisted for more than 3 decades. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Durante and Whitfield's remarkable relationship back to what happened on that stage. Years after Durante's own death, when researchers and historians began examining the full scope of his extensive wartime touring for various retrospective projects, several specifically identified this particular broadcast as one of the only genuine primary sources available, describing the actual substance of his sustained commitment to Whitfield. Given that virtually no other documentation of the relationship survived in Durante's own extensively catalogued professional archives, a specific and deliberate absence that itself reflected exactly how completely he had honored the original spirit of quiet, unpublicized generosity that had defined the entire 3-decade relationship. One historian, examining the broader tradition of wartime entertainer visits to military hospitals, noted that this broadcast provided a rare and genuinely valuable window into exactly what those visits sometimes produced beyond their immediate morale-boosting purpose, evidence that a single afternoon of genuine attention could, in the right circumstances, initiate a relationship of sustained care that meaningfully shaped an entire family's trajectory across multiple subsequent decades. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the promises you have made, and the specific, sustained follow-through those promises might still require years or even decades later, long after anyone else would blame you for having quietly let them go. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that genuine promises are proven not in the moment they're made, but in the decades of quiet follow-through afterward. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the private commitments behind America's most beloved public figures. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about a promise in your own life you have quietly kept for far longer than anyone ever expected you to. The kind of promise that mattered most precisely because you kept honoring it, long after anyone was still watching, to see whether you would.